but if you talk to any of them today, they will tell you they are all victims now of overtraining in their 20s and early 30s, which then was a really good idea because those guys were the leaders and everybody in the sport emulated what those guys were doing. And in retrospect, they were doing it wrong.
Welcome to the Chief Endurance Officer Podcast. I'm your host, Greg McDonough. Each week, we hear real-time stories from athletes and CEOs on how to maximize performance through an endurance mindset. Let's get started.
Well, welcome to the show. I am pumped for our guest today. He is a seasoned executive with a proven track record of securing over $400 million in verifiable business growth across sports, entertainment, media, technology sector. They got significant leadership roles in Universal Studios, Association of Volleyball Professionals, CAT Sports, and Speedo, one of my favorites. At ASM Global, he played a critical role in assembling a partnership team that had helped achieve revenue growth that led them to a $2.3 billion acquisition. Another fellow podcast host of the Best Boss Ever podcast. Please welcome Carl Thomas. Carl, it's great having you on the show.
Greg, can't thank you enough for having me. Really looking forward to this session.
As we talked before, I love getting into the endurance mindset. So Carl, can you tell me how your endurance mindset has impacted your life unexpectedly?
Well, I'm still at it. One of those things that, people look at me and then hear that I have 6 grandchildren and they go, well, wait, you're clearly not old enough to have 6 grandchildren. And the fact of the matter is I do have 6 grandchildren, but the endurance factor is, I think, summed up in sort of never quit, never give up, keep going, and find the ways and means to adjust along the way as either you get older, which in my case clearly has happened and is the case, or the dynamic or environment changes that requires you to pivot or adjust or sort of look at it through a different lens, right? And I think the willingness to innovate, explore, adapt, pivot, use whatever word you want, combined with your unwillingness to quit and give up, together, those things make for a pretty darn good combination.
Very well said. And that combination is spot on. I would love to draw some parallels to what you've seen in sport with those characteristics and how it plays out in business.
Right. Well, quick overview, sorry, Greg, for you. In my sporting background and career, I was a competitive swimmer from the age of 6, was fortunate enough to get an athletic scholarship to attend UCLA, which I did. I had never played water polo, but loved the idea of water polo because my high school team didn't have a water polo program. So when I got to UCLA as a scholarship swimmer, I was immediately required to get in the pool and join the water polo squad, which back then at UCLA, a perennial NCAA Division I contender, well over 10 NCAA national championships in water polo. I was a member of 2 of those NCAA championship teams. But I learned early on as I got in the pool as an incoming sort of rank green freshman at UCLA with 7 first-team All-Americans on my team in water polo. I literally, had a, if you will, a sort of a cursory understanding of the game, but I learned really fast because I got my butt kicked up and down the pool by these guys. Good news is I ended up making the starting UCLA water polo team. As I mentioned, we won 2 national championships there. More importantly for me, that experience led to me getting an offer to compete on the U.S. national water polo team, which I did, and at the same time, I swam all the way through college, went to the 1972, now I'm really going to date myself, Olympic trials, and finished 5th in the 200 IM, missed the U.S. Olympic team by less than half a second.
That's super insightful, Carl, and I appreciate that. I'm stuck on the half a second because, I've never been to that level. I love doing endurance events. I'm a triathlete at heart. But what makes me appreciate from that competitive perspective, and especially as you get even shorter distances, swimming down to like the 50 free, is how precise and how close those that get on the television to make it to the team and those that just miss And I'd love to hear sort of the mentality, the mindset it takes to be on both ends of that, split second, point one difference when you're standing on the starting block knowing that, this could be a .01 miss or a .01 make, and how that kind of impacts you personally.
Well, you don't trust me. It's not that fun being on the wrong end of that .01. And in my case, and in my era, if you will, because things have changed, Greg, so dramatically in terms of everything: nutrition, training regimens, focus, mechanics, everything from a split second that one might get an advantage off the starting block to, everything from where you swim in the lane to minimize obstruction or ripple effects, or even in the case of moving way over next to a competitor and getting a little bit of a drag off that competitor. All those nuances have been far more dramatic and focal points, I think, of performance, at least in the swimming pool, than certainly when I was competing. But back to the question of, what did endurance, or the concept of endurance, teach me from the sporting life? I had the, really extraordinary and blessed career in swimming and water polo. I mean, I can't thank all the people enough, from coaches to teammates to early on my parents, who put up with a lot of crap doing it, as you would know, to lifelong partnerships and relationships and friendships that I formed out of the pool, both in business and socially. Those things stay with you because, I'll use another sporting analogy. When you're in the fourth quarter of a really tough water polo match and the game is tied and you are flagged dead tired because you've gone up and down the pool way too many times, but you're in the game because you're on the starting six, and the expectation is that you will perform until the final buzzer. And that mentality was instilled in us as a college team by now deceased Hall of Fame coach Bob Horn at UCLA. And he preached, you always win the fourth quarter. And so we were likely, I think at the time, the most highly conditioned team in terms of our ability to sprint, swim, and stay in the game. There is one comment that stayed with me. I spoke of those early days when I was a freshman and getting my butt kicked all over the place by these guys. And I was pretty dejected at one point. And he recognized that, my coach did, and he called me into his office. We made an appointment, and I went, oh God, this is not going to be good, because he's just going to throw me off the team. This isn't going to work at all. And to my amazement, he sat me down in a very encouraging way, and he looked right at me and he said, listen, in his words, right, he used this phrase a lot, don't get your dauber down. So you have a great career on your horizon in water polo, because you have one thing I cannot teach you, and that is speed in the pool. I can teach you all the other things about the game, the strategy, the mechanics, the teamwork, the level of play that's required, spatial requirements, because in water polo, it's very similar to soccer, which we're all experiencing right now. The World Cup, as we record this, we're getting the ball to open space and getting your teammates an opportunity to come onto the ball unobstructed, which was what the speed that I was gifted with in the pool allowed me to do. And it was like a 15-minute meeting. It was short, sweet, and to the point, and I left that super encouraged, and I never looked back.
And you mentioned the World Cup. I'm a big, what I call football, since my parents are British, but soccer. And we are in the middle of the World Cup and excited for the U.S. match tonight. Carl, you mentioned, the tools and resources that athletes had when you were going through your professional career compared to what athletes have today. And one of the things that comes to mind, right, I love doing endurance triathlon, so Ironman distance racing, and the amount of technology, the amount of training, the amount of different types of coaching, the things that are available to me just as a back of the pack finisher are night and day compared to when my wife started this 15 years ago. And that's a pretty short period of time, and not on the elite professional level. I'd love for you to give the audience some insight of where sport has been compared to where it is today? And perhaps give us some insights on where you think 5, 10, 15 years from now, as technology and AI, and nutrition and body composition, like we're learning and learning and learning. What's the future going to bring? But I'd love to do the comparison backwards first.
Sure. So let's just talk about where and how women and men start in sport. It's in youth sport. When I was a kid, there was a local swim club. There wasn't a local soccer club. There was Pop Warner football. I'm not even going to say there was youth basketball. There was Little League baseball, but certainly not lacrosse. And then when you got to high school, that's when sort of more organized sport came into play, but not for girls, only for boys. So that's a huge difference. Interestingly, in swimming, Greg, as you know, from the very first swim practice I went to, there were girls and boys in the pool at the same time. And that, other than my high school boys swimming team and my collegiate men's swimming team, every club I ever swam for had both men and women in the pool at the same time. I spent 4 years at the Santa Clara Swim Club in the heyday of George Haynes, who arguably is one of, if not the best historical swimming coach ever, certainly among the top 5. And he ran a super tight ship on the one hand, but he always injected humor and good-natured fun and you know, if you will, the sort of all for one and one for all mentality. But listen, you get in a training session at Santa Clara Swim Club or the University of Texas or back in the day, Mission Viejo with Mark Schubert, and you had former Olympians, current Olympians, and prospective Olympians all around you. So the notion of the sort of rising tide that lifts all boats is 100% true, and it's as true today as it was 40 years ago. But the differences, as I alluded to earlier, in nutrition, training regimens, the understanding of physiology and how, you know, sort of the neurology, if you will, intersects with the physiology and where the breaking points are physically. Because if you talk to, you know, historical triathletes, and we'll talk about triathlon in a second, but you talk to Mark Allen, you talk to Dave Scott, you talk to Scott Tilley and Scott Molina, the big 4 in the 80s, you virtually couldn't find a triathlon race in the world that one of those 4 guys was a participant in that he didn't win or didn't hit the podium. Those guys were that good. But if you talk to any of them today, they will tell you they are all victims now of overtraining in their 20s and early 30s. Which then was a really good idea because those guys were the leaders and everybody in the sport emulated what those guys were doing. And in retrospect, they were doing it wrong. It didn't impede their performance at the time because everybody was sort of, you know, on the same playing field at the same time. And I'd say that's actually true today. The different eras of sport, from youth all the way up to and through elite, and if you're fortunate enough to be in a sport that has professional ranks and you go on to be a professional, good for you. But those environments tend to travel with, and then the next generation comes up, the next generation of athletes, the next generation of coaches, the next generation of scientific evidence, the next generation of nutritional study. And if there's one thing that you could look at today that I think is hugely different than it was when I was growing up as an athlete, was the science of nutrition. How and when to feed your body, how and when to hydrate, not just how and when, but what to do it with, the benefits of, you know, the right meal composition at the right time to optimize performance. This whole notion of carbo loading back in the 80s, where people would go to the Ironman and 2 days or 3 days before the event, eat 3 plates full of pasta. You know, it was a thing, and it was actually a fun thing to do, but did it actually, in truth, deliver nutritional value for that individual? I rather think not. But, you know, the sport of triathlon is relatively new in the world. I mean, depending on who you talk to, you can go back to sometime in the 70s when triathlon sort of had its first heyday. There are those that will go back decades prior to that. But you know, it sort of came into the public consciousness in the late 70s when Barry McDermott, then a Sports Illustrated journalist, wrote a story about the Ironman. And the Ironman at the time, I want to say, was 2 years old. And it originated not in Kona, where it has been for the last few decades, but on the island of Oahu. And it combined three existing events that took place on Oahu: the Duke-Hanamoku open water, rough water swim, which is where the mileage for the Ironman swim came from. There was a bicycle race around the island of Oahu, and that's where your 140-mile plus bike ride came from. And there was the Honolulu Marathon. So the early folks who said, okay, let's put all those three together and see if we can do them all in one day. That's how it started. So Barry writes an article about it. At the time, I am at Speedo Swimwear. I spent 7 years at Speedo. And I read that article and I went, that's super interesting, and sort of ruminated on it. And then, while at Speedo, the 1980 Olympics get, boycotted by the U.S. in the wake of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And so no U.S. athlete goes to Moscow. But there's no less enthusiasm, right, around not only the Olympic Games, but sport in general. And so I'm looking, we at Speedo, we're looking deeply into research. And there was an organization, it no longer exists, was Sporting Goods Manufacturers Association, who was continually investing in research. And it was a trade organization. And in terms of participatory sports, the top three sports in which individuals participated, whether they were weekend warriors or Johnny-come-latelys or more, athletically inclined students, were swimming, cycling, and running. Those three sports. And I think that's probably true today. If you just did the raw data analysis in the aggregate, swimming, cycling, and running would still rank as the top three participation sports, because people, walk out the door and do them all. So as that research came to the fore, I went back to that Sports Illustrated article and I said, listen, and the Ironman continued to gain fame. And while Julie Moss was crawling across the finish line on ABC's Wide World of Sports, everybody, if you haven't seen that YouTube clip, just go find it. It's pretty amazing. But that really put triathlon on a global format. And the Wide World of Sports back then in the early 80s was the creme de la creme of aggregated sports events that were not mainstream. And so I looked at that and I said, listen, this was, Frank Shorter through the 70s. Jim Fixx writes his book about running, and there's this sort of fascination with endurance athletics. But you look at the Ironman format and you look at it today, and I'm going to call it a gruelathon, and I called it a gruelathon 45 years ago because it is. Now, it has stood the test of time, and a lot of folks still do it, you and your wife included, for the weekend warrior. And I think still today, anybody who trains for a marathon, if their goal is 3 hours or less, that's a pretty darn good goal. And it takes a fair amount of focus, training, regimen, and, the endurance mindset to get your body in shape to clip under 3 hours in a full marathon. So I came up with a triathlon format while the vice president at Speedo, and we rolled this format out in 5 cities in 1982. And the initial format was 2K swim, 30K 35K bike, 15K run. We adjusted that format in 1983 to 1,500 meters swim, 35K bike, 15K run. And then in 1984, I looked around and I said, this doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons. So I adjusted the format again. So we're now in our third year of what then was called the Bud Light U.S. Triathlon Series. We got Anheuser-Busch to come in as the naming rights sponsor, and we adjusted the distances and the format to 1,500 meter swim, which then was the longest swimming competition in in the Olympics, 1,500 meters, and it was only for guys. It wasn't for women. 40K bike, which is a standard time trialing distance, still is today in cycling, and a 10K run. And everybody knew what a 10K run. And 10,000 meters was the longest track event in the Olympic track and field competition, not the road event. So we adjusted the format in 1984. We also introduced wave starts in 1984. We also introduced age group designations by cap color in the swim. So we put all these together, and that sort of was an aha moment for the sport of triathlon, because it brought into play not only a more recognizable, understandable, and doable distance, but it brought into play safety measures with the brightly colored caps in the open water swimming, and it brought into play much more safe starts, and we were able to stagger the starts. And so you had, the advancement of timing systems was early, but it was still happening. So you add all those things together, and we've got what is today still the Olympic distance. And while I was doing that, we're 3 years in, I'm still at Speedo Swimwear. I left Speedo in after 1984, but I co-founded what is now USA Triathlon. It wasn't called that then. One of the early members of the board of directors, and one of the things we did at the US Triathlon Series, as USA Triathlon sort of came into its own, is we required every participant in our series to become then a TriFed USA member. What that did was it provided a stable membership base for the federation. In exchange, we got the benefit of the TriFed insurance policy, so we didn't have to go shop insurance on the outside. And then we continually and consistently looked to improve both the federation in terms of sanctioning rules and regulations, a sanctioning governing body. Because in the end, national governing bodies or international federations are more about rules, regulations, and, if you will, membership than they are about event creation and event management. And that's a really interesting nuance. And I think many NGBs, national governing bodies, for those that aren't familiar, struggle with the difference between being a sanctioning body, a governing body, a rules and regulations body, or an event management company at the same time. Those two things are dramatically different and much require literally no overlap in expertise to execute on both sides. So, at the same time we were doing the USA Triathlon national governing body, I co-founded what became the International Triathlon Union, which is now World Triathlon, and was the first treasurer of that organization. And this president, now deceased Canadian, Les McDonald, he and I chased the IOC all over the world for about 4 years, lobbying to have triathlon included in the Olympic Games. We were in Barcelona in 1992 at the IOC executive meetings, about 4 months in advance of the Barcelona Olympic Games in 1992. Juan Antonio Samaranch was still the IOC chairman / CEO. Their meeting broke, and he obviously knew who we were because we've been, chasing him all over the world for all these years. And he walks right up to us as that meeting broke, and he shook out his hand and he said, "Congratulations, you are now recognized. You have recognition." And Les and I looked at each other and said, "Thanks, great." And then he walked away, and I look at Les and I said, "What the hell does that mean? Recognition?" It turns out what it meant was the IOC, in recognizing the ITU as the one and only international federation and sanctioning body for a triathlon worldwide, built an impenetrable fence around the ITU as the one, the only, the exclusive. And 12 months later, we were co-opted onto the Olympic program for Sydney 2000, both men and women. Interestingly, and then I'll leave the subject unless you want to ask me more, and I'm happy to rant on about this as long as you want to. When we initially started the US Triathlon Series, we gave out prize money. The prize money grew over the 12 years we operated the series. It grew every year. And we always, from the very first event, awarded equal prize money to both men and women. That never changed. From 1982 to 1994, it was always equality for men and women in terms of prize money.
That's awesome. Carl, and when we chatted a few weeks ago, just hearing these stories and knowing what this audience wants to chew on, I mean, like you're bringing us back to the beginning. It's fantastic. I'm curious with like Super Tri and T100 and these new formats that are coming in. Do you see the sport developing again, or is this just a different slice, different audience? Like, give us a sense of what 5-10 years from now looks like for the sport.
Well, it's going to continue to grow. The innovation will continue. You asked about AI. I mean, AI from a training regimen, coaches can, go on there and do whatever they do. They can publish on Substack. They can do whatever they want. But at the end of the day, AI is information, it's methodology, it's process, it's facts, figures. You got to check them, but, it is what it is. But nothing takes the place of the physical requirement for training, regardless of format. I love the relay concept. I love that triathlon is now engaged in relays and Olympic competition. I think that's awesome. And I think the limitations are only as far as individuals or groups allow themselves to imagine what might be next. So I'm a huge proponent of the future is not set in stone. It will evolve. It has to evolve. You're either coming together or you're coming apart, right? You're not staying in the same place.
And what I love about where triathlon is today, like compared to when I started, I was a soccer player, swimmer, a little bit of track, but mostly to stay in shape for soccer season. Triathlon wasn't a thing in youth sports. I mean, you'd swim over the summers, you'd swim in high school, winter swim, you had your year-round clubs. And I entered triathlon through swimming, where many enter it through running. But back 15 years ago, 10 years ago when I started, it was much more of a secondary sport. Like I couldn't play soccer anymore because my knees were just aching. And it's much easier for me to go forward and backward than it is side to side. And so I shifted over to triathlon and I've fallen in love with it. And now you're seeing it being introduced at a much younger level. Any thoughts or insights on just sort of that develop, like how welcoming triathlon has been as a sport relative to other sports that have been around and popular?
Well, I think, there's been fits and starts there, Greg. I mean, listen, back in the 80s, the Ironman group launched an Iron Kids program, which was a version of what you've just described in terms of youth sports. A fair number of kids, I can't tell you exactly how many, participated in that and got their exposure to triathlon through these youth groups. I know a lot of parents, generation below me, who are triathletes, love triathlon, and they've taken on the obligation, responsibility to expose their kids to triathlons, to take them to events, to where kids are, a kids division, if you will, or a youth division is part of an event, and encouraging their kids to get involved. I think this is one of the things where the federation obligation and responsibility rests. Great. Local triathlon clubs for kids. Every city has, a triathlon club, or they used to. I don't know if they do anymore. But the point being, from my perspective, there should be a very solid initiative, if it's not already substantially underway, by Triathlon USA to encourage, to support, to promote, to get sanctioning rules, regs, and guidelines in place for youth divisions in as many triathlon events as possible.
That's awesome. Yeah, my 17, soon to be 18-year-old, I think, is counting down the day to toe the starting line with me, and I'll be tickled. I'll be crying the whole way around for sure when that happens. Carl, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. What are you doing these days?
Well, still at it. So you mentioned the ASM global role. I've had, again, a blessed career. I've been in lots of different segments of the sporting, media, and entertainment industry. ASM Global was formed in 2019 by the merger of what was the Spectacor Management Group, almost a 50-year-old company, Philadelphia-based, that was owned at the time by a private equity firm out of Toronto, Onyx Capital, and the AEG Facilities Management Group. For those of your audience that don't know, AEG stands for the Anschutz Entertainment Group. They own what is now Crypto.com Arena, was the Staples Center in LA Live. They own all of the surrounding elements of LA Live, including the JW Marriott Hotel and the Ritz-Carlton Hotel there. They own the LA Kings, National Hockey League Club. They also own the LA Galaxy, MLS Club, and they own the facilities where the Galaxy play, the Dignity Health Sports Park in Carson. Both those locations, LA Live as well as Dignity Health Sports Park, will be featured venues in the LA 28 Olympic Games. So then the pandemic came. New CEO started. Actually, I'd worked for him twice before at Universal Studios and again at Tickets.com. Name is Ron Benzian, best boss I ever had. He was the impetus and the origin story around my podcast, The Best Boss Ever. He was the very first guest, and we're now, 112 or 113 episodes in. It's really fun to do. So I went to work there at ASM. We were the sort of greatest story never told in the world of sport. We managed 350 venues worldwide. That number is actually up to 450 now. 7 NFL stadiums, a number of NBA arenas, a number of NHL arenas, a number of MLS venues, and then 50 plus arenas in the US where none of those sports participated. And then, they really didn't have an aggressive revenue creation strategy. I was part of a new management team that came in, highly focused on generating revenue. We were on the commercial partnership side. We had all these venues, and we found multi-venue partnerships. We had naming rights partnerships. We secured millions and millions of dollars worth of revenue generation via naming rights. You and I both know that any arena in town that houses any major league sports franchise and NFL stadiums, for that matter, are all named. SoFi Stadium in LA, Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas, State Farm Stadium in Glendale, Arizona, where the Cardinals play. And the list goes on and on and on. So, the backstory there is where there was a minimal, if you will, appreciation of or focus on revenue generation as opposed to just venue management contracts. We were part of a group that came in and started a commercial partnership team from scratch. There were 2 of us. We grew the team to 50 worldwide in combination, corporate as well as local venue sellers where it was appropriate, and, drove a fair amount of revenue for the company, as did, all of the other revenue generation elements, from ticket sales to food and beverage to parking to suites and premium and VIP/Lux experiences and all these venues. And then the company got sold, which is why we were all brought in, because we all knew what the drill was. Get the company ready to sell, which we did a little over 18 months ago. Legends, which was the organization founded by Jerry Jones and the Dallas Cowboys about 20 years ago. They came in with a private equity backing, Sixth Street Capital out of San Francisco. Sixth Street is also a deep player in the world of sport. They own Bay City FC, which is the women's NWSL club in San Francisco, and they have significant investments in Real Madrid and FC Barcelona and others. So that all worked great. And then, my then boss and I started respective consulting businesses. And then at the first of the year, we merged those consulting businesses into an agency called Driven, DRVN, Sports and Entertainment. We've got 5 clients, and we do a variety of performance metrics, from strategy, sales strategy, revenue generation, revenue growth, and, working with our clients in at least 3 instances to expand their presence in the sport and entertainment sectors.
Super helpful, Carl. It's interesting and it's ironic that you're talking about naming rights, and I've been getting a lot of pleasure looking at the World Cup stadiums and how creative those names, like you look at Levi's and they covered up their name with what looks like the back of some jeans, or you look at Gillette and it's like shaving cream has covered the name. And it would have been fun to sit in that room and come up with those creative ideas. You could have just put a black sheet over it, but instead they've gone the other way.
Well, no, that sort of broke the mold, for lack of a better description. I loved that creativity there on both those counts, Greg. Interestingly, The IOC and the LA28 organizing committee have, looked at it differently historically up until what will come 2 years hence in LA. All the Olympic venues that carried naming rights, the same thing had to happen. You had to cover the name of the stadium. What the USOC, LA28, and IOC came up with was in a city like Los Angeles, where there was a 100% commitment to not build any new venues, any new competition sites are 100% portable and will be collapsed and removed post games. What that required, though, is SoFi Stadium, Intuit Dome, Crypto.com Arena, the Honda Center in Anaheim, where the Ducks play, Dignity Health Sports Park, where the Galaxy play. So what they came up with was a methodology to allow the name of the stadium to stay in place for the Olympic Games, provided, big proviso, that SoFi or Crypto.com or Intuit paid incremental money for the right to have their name stay on an Olympic venue through the LA28 Games. Honda did it, Intuit did it, SoFi did it, Crypto, they're all going, yeah, why wouldn't we do this? It's hedging our bet, and we already have this massive investment over 20, 30, 40 years. We're not going to let the biggest sporting event ever to come to Los Angeles and not be beneficiaries of that with our brand name and the reasons we got into the venue naming rights business in the first place.
That's super insightful. Carl, an audience member wants to get in touch with you. What's the best way for them to find you?
I'm super easy. LinkedIn, Carl A. Thomas. You can find me on LinkedIn, not hard at all. Driven, DRVN, sports and entertainment. You can get to me through the website. I'm really easy to find. And most importantly, check into and check out my podcast, The Best Boss Ever. Those 4 words. YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and wherever else podcasts are listened to. And my website there is thebestbossever.com. And all of my contact information is on all of those places. So I'm pretty darn easy to find.
That's awesome. And it's a great show. For those of you who haven't taken a listen, it's eye-opening for sure. Carl, it's been great having you on the show. Audience members, if you got some value today, please subscribe. Please share our content. Please go find Carl on his social media and his podcast. Come check us out at chiefinduranceofficer.com. Carl, again, it's been great having you on the show. And I really, truly appreciate the stories that you shared. I had no real understanding of how the sport that I love sort of has morphed and ebbed and flowed and ebbed and continues to grow and impact my life. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, there's plenty more stories where those came from, Greg. It was really a pleasure. And these conversations are always so fun. So I can't thank you enough for thinking to have me on the show.
My pleasure as well.
Thank you for tuning in to the Chief Endurance Officer podcast. To hear more inspiring stories and strategies around the endurance mindset, be sure to subscribe below or visit us at chiefinduranceofficer.com. Until next time, keep pushing those limits